Hello and welcome to the final episode of Let's Translate Light Novels. If this is your first episode, stop this video and go back and start with episode 1. This will all make a lot more sense. This is like the last page of chapter 1 of Seiran Den, the Nakago prequel novel to Fushigi Yuugi. So anyway, see the video description for details, etc., etc. And let me add a content warning for this episode. We have some violence and we also have some sexual assault, so use discretion. Alright, let's jump into it. その時、母は自分の顔を驚きの表情で見ていた。So その時, we love this little phrase. That time, or that was the moment when, or and then. There's lots of different ways you can translate that, but usually you never want to translate it as like that time or at that time. 母はMatuta, Ayuru's mom, 自分の顔を驚きの表情で見ていた. So 自分 comes up a few times in this section. And I'm just going to clarify now, jibun is ayuru. So jibun, so confusing because jibun no, oftentimes that means like one's own or like my own. So since this sentence is about like Matuta on the surface, sonotoki hahawa, we're starting it with the mom, Matuta, it's easy to think that jibun in this case would mean Matuta. But no, jibun no kao is Ayuru's face. And the reason why it's Ayuru, we're going back to episode 25 of Let's Translate Light Novels. If you remember the thing that happened right before this, Ayuru screamed out Mother Taria, and then he stopped in his tracks and screamed out their names. So if you think that this sentence comes right after that other one, so jibun in this case is Ayuru. 自分の顔を驚きの表情で見ていた. So his mother, then his mother, or like the next moment, boom, his mother looked at his face with an expression of astonishment is what that literally means. So patron A translated that as, an astonished Matuta stared into his eyes. I think その時 needed to be expressed somehow. You kind of need a pause in there. Like, he screamed at the top of his lungs, Mother Taria, and then, like, there was a beat, and then she looked into his face with astonishment. その時, like, it usually has this sort of, like, you can think of it. Don't ever translate it this way. But you can think of it this way, and then it happened. Bum, bum, bum. It's kind of like that. So, like, I'm missing that vibe. I'm missing that, and then it happened sort of thing. And by just leaving out その時は and just an astonished Matuta stared into his eyes. It's not wrong. It's just missing that little coloring in there. Patron B. In that moment, his mother's face looked back at him in an expression of surprise. So Patron B took a little more literal approach with その時 in that moment. It's not wrong. And it does add a little bit of a pause in there that we need. We do need some words coming right before this because, like, then there was a beat. Then there was a little pause. Like a switch was flipped. And then if this were a movie, right, you'd have, like, maybe a sudden lighting change or maybe a sudden camera change. Maybe the background music would suddenly go silent. Maybe there would be a boom noise. Like, that's what this その時 means. It's a very weird way of translating that I just described. But, that's the essence of it. His mother's face looked back at him. It's more his mother. Like, his mother's face sounds a little odd. It's a little too, in an expression of, his mother's face looked back at him in an expression of surprise. That makes the face work a bit. I don't hate it. If I'm reading the whole sentence, in that moment, his mother's face looked back at him in an expression of surprise. That works. Otherwise, like, his mother's face looked back at him in isolation is kind of strange. It's kind of a Japaneseism. It's more his mother looked back at him. But within an expression of surprise, that does make the face work in here. Yeah, I kind of like this all right. His mother's face looked back at him in an expression of surprise. Yeah, what this is doing is it's putting more of the focus on Ayuru. Yeah, cinematically, I can kind of imagine, like, I am Ayuru. Like, the camera is being Ayuru's face, and then you see Matuta, and you see her face turning and, like, looking back with an expression of surprise. I do think this works. If I read it as a whole sentence, it works. If I look at the little parts, it doesn't work as well. But yeah, as a sentence, it works. Small Sarah. It was when he saw his mother's astonished face that something enormous seemed to be building inside of him. Okay, so what Small Sarah did here is she combined this sentence with the next sentence that we haven't gone over yet. So we'll come back to this translation later. But yeah, it was when he saw his mother's astonished face that blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it's a little too matter of fact. It was when he saw his mother's astonished face that's when something happened. It needs to be more, and then it happened. So we're missing that vibe from Small Sarah, but we'll go back. We'll revisit her translation after we look over this next line of Japanese dialogue. Not dialogue, narration. 自分の中で何かとてつもないものがふつふつと吹き上がっていた? I think this is 吹き上がっていた. Ruby, text to the rescue. 湧き上がっていた. That makes much more sense. Yeah, waku is like to boil. So wakiagateita is like bubbling, boiling. Futsu, yeah. It's you think of like a pot of boiling water on the stove when like the bubbles just kind of start to come up to the top and like just when it's about to boil. That's what that is. So jibun no nakade, inside of, again, jibun in this case is ayuru. So inside of ayuru, nanika totetsumonai mono ga. So totetsumonai is like just very ginormous. Yeah, like otherworldly, just so big. All right, so patron A, he felt something tremendous simmering within him. I touched upon this before, especially with the last sections that were very like action heavy and kind of violent. In English prose, you want action heavy moments to have shorter sentences. This part though, I have a feeling, again, this author, just side note, I don't know if you've noticed, I don't know if you've picked up on this, but they have a very, like, cinematic writing style. Like, when I read their writing, I do kind of feel like I'm watching a movie, or I feel like I'm watching an anime. And this part of the scene feels like it's happening in slow motion. It feels like, you know, we're screaming and running, and there's violence and stuff, but then, like, he screams their names as loudly as he can, and he stops in his tracks. And then sunotoki, and then, like, then the background music and all of the sound effects stop and go silent, and the lighting changes, and the camera angle changes, and then we're going a little more in slow motion. So this is a part where I think you could be a little more descriptive with the writing. Like, you could draw things out a little bit more, instead of just simplifying. 自分の中で何かとてつもないものがふつふつと湧き上がっていた. He felt something tremendous simmering within him. It's not wrong, but yeah, it does feel a little short. An astonished Matuta stared into his eyes. He felt something tremendous simmering within him. I don't know. If I'm reading this in Japanese, especially with the commas, you know how I've noted earlier how commas in Japanese often note a pause in speech? その時母は自分の顔を驚きの表情で見ていた。自分の中で何かとてつもないものがふつふつと湧き上がっていた. Like, I kind of feel like this reads more like a poem, or it wants to read more like a poem in Japanese, and like taking a little more time. So I don't know, we could have milked this a little more, but we'll move on. Patron B, he felt something enormous billow up inside. Ooh, I like billow. Billow up inside of him. I think billowing, like patron A did simmering, and I think billowing would have a better feel to this. He felt something enormous billowing because it's happening. We can feel it happening to us, and like maybe the background music, like it got quiet. Now it's kind of welling up to a crescendo. Again, I'm thinking of this like a movie because it really does read that way to me in Japanese. Yeah, I like he felt something enormous billowing up inside of him. Yeah, it's also short, but we'll see how it connects with the other sentences. Okay, now back to Small Sarah. It was when he saw his mother's astonished face that Something enormous seemed to be building inside of him. Building inside of him is kind of weird. Building up inside of him would make a little more sense. But yeah, building isn't quite the right word. I think small Sarah probably just didn't understand wakiagaru, that like to boil, to simmer, to billow. Yeah, building was not a good verb choice. Seemed to be also is not really correct. Like, it wasn't even in Japanese seemed to be. Like, it is something enormous billowing up inside of him. We're going to find out. Actually, in this book, in this text, so far in this chapter, it doesn't say what that something is, but I'll tell you what that something is later. All right, so anyway, yeah, something enormous seemed to be building up inside of him. Nyeh. Imaichi ya na. It was meh. All right, next line of Japanese. 体が燃えるように熱く、今にもその中からマグマが吹き出しそうだった。Ah, that one is fuki. Okay, so 体が燃えるように熱く. So his body was hot, like it was on fire. 今にも、その中からマグマが. So その中から is like his body. マグマが magma 吹き出しそうだった. So it felt as if like magma were going to explode from his body any minute or any second, like imminently. Imanimo, like it could do it even now. Like that's how imminent it is, this sensation. Patron A, his body felt hot, like it was on fire, like magma was about to burst forth at any moment. Yeah, this captures the feeling of the original Japanese. His body felt hot, like it was on fire, comma, like magma was about to burst forth at any moment. Yeah. Patron B, it filled his whole body with heat like a volcano ready to blow. I kind of like a volcano ready to blow. That's where magma is. So combined with that former sentence, he felt something enormous billow up inside of him. It filled his whole body with heat like a volcano ready to blow. See, remember the criticism I had earlier of, oh, this sentence feels too short? Well, on its own, it felt too short. But when you combine it with the next sentence, it's good. It still kind of has that, it reads like a poem sort of thing. And looking at Patron A's, he felt something tremendous simmering within him. His body felt hot, like it was on fire, like magma was about to burst forth at any moment. Like, that works as well. So you can't look at these sentences always in isolation and be like, that wasn't a good translation. You have to look at the whole thing. All right, small Sarah, what do you got? His body was hot, as if it were on fire. Yeah, his body was hot. This is a child we're talking about. Felt hot is definitely better. As if it were on fire, and it seemed like lava was going to explode out of him. It's more like it was going, it seemed like, or it felt like would be better than it seemed like. It seemed like makes it more like an outside party is observing him. Like somebody is watching Ayuru and like, ooh, it looks like he might blow his top at any minute. No, this is Ayuru. Like we need to put the reader into Ayuru's body here. And like he felt like Patron A, his body felt hot like it was on fire, like magma was about to burst forth at any moment. He felt something tremendous simmering within him. Versus small Sarah is like, something enormous seemed to be building inside of him. His body were hot as if it were on fire, and he seemed like lava was going to explode out of him. Small Sarah is putting the description like this is Matuta watching Ayuru, but it's not that. We're trying to get this from Ayuru's POV. This is what the Japanese is doing. So wrong POV, not exactly a mistranslation, but yeah, a slightly wrong vibe here. 母はその時、抱きかかえていたターリアを力の限り遠くへと投げ飛ばした。So again, the その時, it's like, and that moment, and then, bum bum bum, 抱きかかえていたターリア. So Taria, or Talia, who she was holding in her arms, 力の限り, with all of her strength, to the limits of her strength, as all her strength would allow her, 遠くへと, to very, very far away, 投げ飛ばした. So she threw Taria as far away from her as she could with all of her might. And in Japanese, it's a little strange wording, like, she threw Taria, comma, who she was holding before, comma, with all of her might. So yeah, if I were to translate that now, I would just kind of ignore the whole daki kakaete ita Taria wo. I would just be like, Taria wo, chikaru no kagiri toku e to nagetobashita. She flung Taria away from her, like as far away from her as she could, with all of her might, sort of thing. Patron A. Then, with all of her strength, Matuta threw Talia as far away from her as she could. Yeah, that's a good arrangement of it. And I like how Patron A just nixed the whole daki kakaete ita Taria. We know that she was holding Taria. Patron B. With all her strength, his mother flung Taria towards him. So again, Patron B is putting the focus on Ayuru here, which is what the Japanese was doing too. And yeah, I feel like it's lacking some words on its own. Read with the former sentences, so he felt something enormous billow up inside of him. It filled his whole body with heat, like a volcano ready to blow. With all her strength, his mother flung Taria towards him. I think it still needs like a little thingy here. Ha wa sono toki. Like, she had a realization then, basically. And that's what prompted her to fling Taria towards him with all her might. And actually, she wasn't throwing Taria towards Ayuru, necessarily. The Japanese did not specify that. She just flung Taria as far away from her as she possibly could. It doesn't really matter, like, based off of this particular section that we have, that Taria is thrown towards Ayuru or just far away. It kind of matters, like, once you find out what actually happens, but you don't find out what actually happens until Chapter 2. Chapter 1 kind of ends on a cliffhanger, so I do not blame Patron B for making that leap. Small Sarah, his mother threw Taria far away from her with the last of her strength. Oh, I love that, with the last of her strength. Oh, that hits me in the feels. Oh, that's great. Small Sarah, you have moments of brilliance. You're like wrong in some places and weird in others, but then there's just moments of brilliance in here that I really like. Yeah, his mother threw Taria far away from her. Yeah, like far away from her is correct. It gets a bit muddy though, since Taria also uses she, her pronouns. I don't know. My brain was like, oh, she threw Taria far away from Taria. What? Yeah. It also is missing that haha wa sono toki. It's kind of missing that, like, boom, you know, then it happened vibe. With the last of, but I love with the last of her strength. That is great. All right, the second to last bit. This is the last bit of narration of this entire series. And it's long. We've got 2 sentences, and this it's not very pleasant to read, but let's soldier on. Ooh, that was a really bad turn of phrase to use. Let's go. Heishi ni hiki taosareta matuta no fuku ga danbou ni hagitorareru. Furi kazasareta ippon no ken no shita nokori no heishi ga haha no ue ni muragari kakatta. So heishi is soldiers. Hikitao sareta, matuta. So matuta was hikitao sareta. So hikitaosu is to, like, to pull or to yank or to drag someone onto the ground, basically. So taosareta was caused to. So matuta was, like, yanked backwards onto the ground. And then no fukuga, so her clothes, danbou ni hagitorareru, were roughly or violently ripped off. Furi kazasareta, so this is like brandished, like raised high in a threatening manner, like, I'm gonna skewer you with this sword, but you're not skewering her with the sword, you're just holding it up above her threateningly like that. Ippon no ken no shita, so beneath a single sword, brandished high, nokori no heishi ga, so the remaining soldiers, haha no ue ni, on top of his mother, muragari kakatta. So muragaru is to herd or to swarm. And then kakaru is to, like, be, like, about to do a verb. So they were, like, about to swarm on top of her, while one of the other soldiers held his sword high in, like, in a threatening, menacing manner. Told you it's not very pleasant to read. If you've seen the anime all the way through, like this scene is in the flashback that we see at the very end in Nakago's final moments in the series. So, Patron A translated it as, a soldier knocked Matuta to the ground and then violently ripped the clothes from her body. With the blade of a sword pointed at her throat, the remaining soldiers swarmed over her. Yeah, I like swarmed. Like, any kind of words or verbs that paint these soldiers as non-human. They're not human. They are monsters. So swarming is good because it paints the picture that they're not human, that there's some kind of like insect or monster. A soldier knocked Matuta to the ground. Yeah, we don't know if it's a soldier or soldiers, but it doesn't really matter. Knocked her to the ground isn't exactly literally right. It's more he like yanked her to the ground, but that's very nitpicky. Violently ripped the clothes from her body. Violently, like rambo ni. Often I don't want to translate that as violently, but in this case, violently works quite well. It gets called for because, they're soldiers and they're being violent. With the blade of a sword pointed at her throat, I kind of like pointed at her throat. It gets across the whole, like, brandished menacingly in a threatening way, like, if you struggle or if you try to escape, we'll kill you sort of thing. Even though it does not literally say in Japanese that the sword tip is at her throat, like, by saying that it's pointed at her throat, it gives us a really good picture of exactly what's going on here. And the remaining soldiers swarmed over her is good too. Patron B, the soldiers pulled at Matuta's clothes, tearing them off. Wait a minute. We missed the part where she got knocked over. The soldiers pulled at Matuta's clothes, tearing them off. While one soldier still held a sword above her, the others swarmed over her. While always just kind of makes things to me sound like procedural, kind of like a cookbook. While the pasta's boiling, add the tomatoes to the skillet. Yeah, it almost sounds procedural. This doesn't have as much emotion as Patron A's. The soldiers pulled at Matuta's clothes, tearing them off. We're missing the violently or the roughly, rambo ni. While one soldier still held a sword above her. I like the still held a sword above her. The others swarmed over her. I like the others instead of the remaining soldiers. You don't really need remaining soldiers, just the other soldiers. Yeah, I think we're missing a little bit of, like, darkness and emotionality here, but it's not wrong. Small Sarah. Wow, Small Sarah did, like, a long translation for this. The soldiers who had knocked Matuta down roughly tore her clothes off. Yeah, see, it's weird if you like separate that with commas and stuff. The soldiers who had knocked Matuta down and roughly tore her clothes off. You don't have to be like, the soldiers who had knocked Matuta down roughly tore her. No, just the soldiers knocked Matuta down and roughly tore her clothes off. That would be a lot stronger. While one man held her still under the blade of his sword. Ooh, I like that too. The other soldiers all crowded on top of her. I think swarmed would be better than crowded. Again, crowded, it doesn't, make them sound like animals or monsters as much as swarmed does. That verb choice. But I do like while one man held her still under the blade of his sword. I like that. Again, it paints that picture of, like, one man is, like, threatening to kill her with his sword, basically, while the others are about to do something terrible to her. And then the last line of this entire series, oh my god, well, it's the last line of chapter 1 of the book, but the last line of this series, Let's Translate Light Novels, it is Kasama! With 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 small A's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dashes, 3 small tsus, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 exclamation points. Japanese lettering is really good at really illustrating the way a person's voice sounds when they're saying something. So this kasama, you can imagine it's the loudest, shrillest shriek. And the ah part of it is really dragged out for a very long time. And it is, like, incredibly loud because of all those exclamation points. It's incredibly loud, it's incredibly emotional. and it's incredibly shrill. And you have that ah, just like dragging on at the very end. In Japanese, this works pretty well. It's very nice that Japanese words end in vowels all the time, especially if it's an ah vowel, because then it just automatically sounds like a natural scream that you would do. So let's see how we all did that. Patron A did no, mother, in italics with 3 exclamation points. I like that choice. Again, you can use all caps sometimes or italics to really illustrate in English, okay, this is like, I almost said an ethereal scream. It's not ethereal. It's like the opposite of ethereal. It's like a primal scream. That's what I meant. If it's like in all caps or in italics. It's primal, it's emotional, it's raw. And then 3 exclamation points is usually the limit that we're allowed in English prose. We wouldn't be allowed to do 8 exclamation points. Really, if you do like 8 exclamation points in English, it just looks dumb. It just looks really silly. Like, it depends. It depends on the font that you're using. Like letterers, if there are any letterers watching this video, you can chime in with your opinions on, because you know more than I do about like making words look cool and making typesetting look cool. But yeah, usually as, you know, for writing in English, you're discouraged from using like more than 3 exclamation points together. Something like this, I think you could maybe get away with more. But yeah, Patron A did not choose to like go, no, which is smart, because again, in English, that looks cheesy if you just go like, no. And I like the choice to add the no in there because it adds more emotionality to it than just plain mother. So that was a good choice. Patron B is just mother in all caps with what looks like 5 exclamation points. Now note, with it being in all caps like this, I think the 5 exclamation points don't look too out of place because capital letters are wider. So I think that works okay with 5 exclamation points. And all caps, again, that's another choice. You could even do like all caps and italics for this. I think that would work too. And then small Sarah, mother, with like, did I do 8 exclamation points? I think I did 8 exclamation points. Yeah, so just, I don't know, maybe it's just me? I don't think it's just me. I think it just looks really silly to have all those R's hanging like that. And then if you imagine vocalizing that, mother, like it just sounds weird going like that. In Japanese, it's cool because it's kasama, and like that's how a person shrieks. They go ah, so it works. But in English, mother, it's just kind of weird. It's supposed to be incredibly emotional, and like as a reader, you're supposed to be shocked and horrified and like maybe crying reading that. But instead, it's kind of silly to see all those R's. It's tough, actually. You might think, oh, it's a really easy thing to translate. Just translate it as mother. But again, like, looking at small Sarah's, just mother, it just looks dumb. I think Patron A and Patron B's are fine. But it is a little, and Patron B even made a note, like, this seems like an odd place to end a chapter, or an odd way to end a chapter, just having him scream mother. Like, if this were being written originally in English, it would be more like he screamed his mother's name and then everything went black. That's kind of how it would probably be written in English. I think that's kind of the vibe that the author was going for here. Again, this is cinematic. I think if this were a movie or if it were an anime, you'd have that scene of the soldiers about to sexually assault his mother by sword point, and then you probably would have a black screen with him screaming, Kasama! And then there would be like 2 or 3 seconds of silence, and then the new scene would come up. Like if you're thinking cinematically. But as a book, it doesn't quite do that as well. Anyway, these are all things to think about. And it's a sad note to end on, to end this series on, but it is a sad book. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the series, it is out of print. It is long out of print, so I don't know if you could even find a copy of this in Japanese anymore. Try eBay. But for a brief overview of what happens in the rest of this book, basically, like if you've seen Fushigi Yuugi, you know Nakago becomes the villain of that series. And in his final moments at the end of the series, they briefly go over kind of what happened to him in his childhood, how he was part of the Heen, and how the Heen were destroyed. And the Emperor of Kuto, though, took in Nakago, because, Ayuru, because he is Nakago. He is one of Seiryu's 7 chosen warriors. And when he screamed his mom, and when he felt that magma boiling up inside of him, that was his powers coming out for the very first time. And in what his powers are is he has a ki blast, a blast of energy from his forehead. That's where his magic symbol appears, his forehead. And what happened was he killed the soldiers and his mom in that moment with that blast of energy. That's what actually happened then. And so the soldiers recognized, oh, shit, he's one of the 7 warriors. And so they take him and Taria back. And the emperor takes a personal liking to Ayuru in a very gross way, which I'm not going to talk about in this video. And yeah, Ayuru has a very terrible, abused childhood under the Emperor of Kuto, and he trains to be a soldier, and he basically plots his revenge, that he's eventually going to get back at the Emperor and Kuto for destroying his people and his mother. So that's kind of, that's Nakago's main story arc, his character arc. And this book kind of covers part of that. It covers him meeting Soi and Tomo as well, other Seiryu warriors. Yeah, but I don't know if you can find the book anywhere. So if you've watched every single episode in this Let's Translate light novel series, you have a pretty good overview by now of how to translate light novels. The do's and don'ts, what techniques you can use, what pitfalls you should avoid, and overall just try to make it read well in English. You know, at the end of the day, especially for commercial translation, that's what you want. You want a finished product that sounds like it was originally written in English and that people will enjoy reading. Not only that people will enjoy reading, but like people will get the same emotional reaction and have as similar an experience as possible to the experience that people have who are native Japanese speakers reading it in Japanese. And all of my patrons who participated, I've had many patrons participate in the series along the way. All of them did really well, actually, and I'd say, like, all of them, I don't think, with an exception of any, I think all of them could pursue light novel translation if they wanted to. Like, some of them are a little closer to actually being professional light novel translators than others, but yeah, I think they all have what it takes. And a special shout out to Patron A for participating in every single video. They're the only patron that participated in every single video. So that is all for the Let's Translate Light Novels series. I will be back later in the summer with Let's Translate Manga. We're going to take a little break on this channel before that series. There's going to be more information about that in Patreon post and in community tab post, and I might put a pinned comment in the comment section of this video as well. There will be other videos in the meantime before Let's Translate Manga starts. But yeah, there will be a while until the next Let's Translate series. Anyway, thanks again for everyone who has participated in the series as a translator, for all of you who've watched it all the way through, and a special thanks to Greg Lay, Henry Roaming, and Data Fox, my super patrons. And if you're not subscribed already to Sarah Moon, my main channel, go subscribe over there, because I'm working on a big video for that channel, which I hope to have out before Let's Translate Manga. That's why I'm delaying the next Let's Translate series on here. Bye!